Hi, my name is Kaylin, and today I'm going to be talking about traumatic brain injury. So, first thing I wanted to do by starting off my presentation is talk about how March is Brain Injury Awareness Month. I have done a lot of research about traumatic brain injury over the past few weeks, and I thought it was pretty coincidental that it is Brain Injury Awareness Month while I was researching this. So, I just thought that was super important to acknowledge and put in my slideshow. So, I just wanted to start off by sharing that. Next, I want to talk about what exactly is traumatic brain injury. So, traumatic brain injury, there's actually two different types of traumatic brain injury that one can have, and the two types are penetrating and non penetrating. Penetrating is going to be when an object is actually piercing the skull. So, that's going to be like getting hit with something and it's actually piercing and going through the skull. While non penetrating is when an external force moves the brain within the skull and it's not going to be penetrating. So, nothing is actually going in the brain, but your brain is actually moving within the skull. And then the type of TBI, which is, if I say TBI throughout this presentation, it just means traumatic brain injury, just to shorten it a little bit. But a type of TBI can determine their symptoms when they go into the hospital to get diagnosed, like their short-term symptoms, as well as their long-term symptoms. More serious TBIs can actually lead to permanent brain injury and sometimes even death, depending on how severe they are. Who all is affected? This slide is very dense compared to some of my other slides, but I thought it was very important to talk about just who's affected in our population. So currently there's 10 million Americans reported sustaining a TBI in the past year, affecting 2.2% of children and 3.3% of adults. I also inserted this super helpful bar graph that kind of tells us about the deaths of TBIs throughout the years, or throughout the months of, I believe that was from 2022. And then according to the CDC, there was approximately 214,000 TBI related hospitalizations in 2020, and 69,000 of those were TBI related deaths. Males were nearly 2 times more likely to be hospitalized and 3 times more likely to die from TBIs than females. And then all of this information I did get from the CDC. And then according to the International Brain Injury Association, of all types of injury, those to the brain are amongst the most likely to result in death or permanent disability. Why is studying traumatic brain injury so important? Traumatic brain injury is considered a low instance disability by the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which basically means that it affects a low percentage of the population, but that doesn't mean it's not important because of the long-term effects that it has. It can affect people's cognition, memory, language, and educational regulation, as well as having different severity levels depending on if you had a penetrating or non-penetrating TBI and just how severe your brain injury was. And it's also important for schools to understand a student's level of traumatic brain injury to ensure they can have the proper support to support them throughout their time in their school. How can a TBI be diagnosed? The Glasgow Coma Scale is a 15-point scale that doctors will use to diagnose a TBI. And then also we have a CT scan and MRI scan, which I inserted a picture of an MRI scan right there. And then also an intracranial pressure monitor, which is a monitor that is actually inserted into the brain, and it checks the pressure that is in the brain and also can assess just how much damage is done to the brain from the traumatic brain injury. And then next I wanted to talk about some educational challenges, because that is the important part of all of this, is us as future teachers, how can we best accommodate those who do suffer from traumatic brain injuries? So memory loss is a huge problem, a huge challenge, because it is a big part of the brain. They also may need frequent breaks because of a lack of attention, extra time completing classwork, participation, social skills. Missed class time for doctor's appointment is a huge one, and then also depression and anxiety, because it's also important to focus on social challenges as well, or social and emotional, which I talk about a little bit on the next slide. So then we have behavioral challenges. This can be depression, anxiety, impulsivity. All of these can be outbursts, like verbal and physical outbursts. They can also be aggressive or disruptive and need emotional regulation or suffer with their emotional regulation. They also may have social behavior challenges and low motivation. So that's why it's really important, and I'll talk about this later, but when it comes into collaboration, it's very important for these students and for these people to have access to a therapist and a counselor and different people that we need in collaboration to support these students' success. Some teaching strategies we have that we can benefit these students with is we have an adjust to curriculum assessments. This can be a huge one. Some studies have stated that it is better for students to be tested not just on language, because a big thing is when they're being assessed, they're just being assessed on one topic. Instead, they should be looked at as a whole and tested that way. And then provide fill-in notes. That's very important because they do have a very short attention span most of the time. So if we just provide little fill-ins for the student to focus on, then they won't have to focus on making all of their own notes. And once again, it depends on the severity and the specific student's needs, but we can also provide a note taker. A student in the class can supply the student with notes that the teacher would copy, or like a note taker could come in and could be like a teacher aide in the classroom. And then some important things that the teacher can do is like repeating key points because of the memory problems that they suffer from. Also repeating and summarizing often. Like it's very important that the teacher summarize to them a lot and let them know what's going on. Allow students to tape and record, which is another big one, because if they are having those memory issues, it is so beneficial for them to be able to go back and re-listen to what the teacher taught. And then having students sit in the front, that way she can do verbal and nonverbal cues. It's very important for teachers to not single out a student. So if she even goes up to the student and taps on their desk just to let them know like, hey, let's get back on track, that could be super helpful for them. Another thing is paraphrasing in those notes, leaving out things that aren't necessarily essential because of that short attention span. And then also providing a weekly planner with weekly due dates. That way the student isn't stressed out about what is due because they aren't remembering. Some accommodations, which would go more so on the 504 plan or the IEP that the student would have, which I'll also go into later in the presentation, is extended time, brain breaks, accessible seating, which like I said is in the front, or if they need to be by like the speaker in the classroom, if there is like a speaker for the teacher, and then fill-in notes. A teacher aide can also be very helpful for them, provided outlines and extra support on materials, and also the extended time goes with that hand in hand. If they need extra time, then they are able to get that. Okay, some collaboration. These are people that are vital for the student's success and also vital for the teacher to get help on how she should be accommodating this student. We have a physical therapist, which can be super important, an occupational therapist, so we're working on like fine motor skills, and then teacher's aide, a speech language pathologist, a school psychologist, which I said can really help with some of the behavioral issues that the student may suffer from, a school nurse, and a school counselor, and a behavioral needs specialist, which once again will help the student with some of those outbursts that they're dealing with, which is super important for their time in the classroom. Some of the assistive technology that can be helpful for a student with a traumatic brain injury is a digital calendar, which I know I mentioned before, the teacher providing the student with when assignments are due, but a digital calendar can be super helpful because it can not only remind them of assignments, but remind them of what they're going to be doing in class that day and what their week is going to look like. So that way they don't have to rely on their poor memory and they can just rely on like the facts and look at it. And then what you see here on the right is a Go Talk device. If a student is having problems speaking, then this can actually speak for them. They can just type what they want to say and this will talk for them, which can be super helpful. And then also voice recorders, like I had previously mentioned, can be super beneficial so they can record what the teacher is saying and listen to it later. Then the legal, ethical, and policies. The IDEA is a huge part of this. This is what recognizes traumatic brain injury as a disability, as a low incidence disability, and is super important. And then their 504 plan and IEP helps them get the accommodations they deserve and is also protected under the IDEA. And then also, like, it's super important that the disability is identified and evaluated. That way they can receive those proper accommodations. And then educated in an inclusive setting. It's super important for teachers to be educated and know how to deal with a student that needs these accommodations, and also promote a classroom of inclusiveness. And then also legal protection against discrimination is a super big part of this. Everyone is should be treated equally regardless of who they are and what they have. Every student is treated the same. So legal, ethical, and policies is a huge part of this, and so is 504 plans and IEPs for students with traumatic brain injuries. In conclusion, just because TBIs are low incidence doesn't mean they should be ignored. I know I mentioned earlier that 2.2% of children struggle with TBIs, but that is actually a way larger number than it seems when you put it into the United States scale. But it doesn't mean it's not important, because these students do have needs and they do need accommodation. So it's important for us as teachers, or as future teachers, to be to have knowledge on how to deal with a student with a traumatic brain injury, even if it is low incidence. Collaboration is also very important. I know I mentioned throughout the slideshow of many different people that are important to collaboration, different therapists, different specialists that can really help not only the student, but teachers as well. Also, promoting inclusivity is one of the most important parts, and just following those accommodations on the 504 plans and the IEPs. For future directions, we can do better policies. There's always a way to better our classroom, future classrooms, and better ourselves as teachers. So if we better our policies, more training for teachers on how to deal with accommodations and how to deal with students who do have traumatic brain injuries, and also new assistive technologies. There are very few assistive technologies that I was able to find besides the few that I listed for students with traumatic brain injuries, and the more innovative that we become, the more assistive technologies that will come out, hopefully. And yeah, that is my entire presentation on traumatic brain injury.